I can't think of another example of something so concrete from the real world that an author uses to save the life of their fictional character. Welcome to Write Like. In this series, I take a look at some of the techniques and styles of some of your favourite authors and figure out how they work so that you can use them too. Today, it's Andy Weir. If you're not familiar, Andy Weir is a sci-fi author and his books are great for blurring the lines between demonstrable real science and fiction. They're also really readable and pretty funny as well. His most famous book, and the one that I'll be discussing today, is The Martian, which was of course adapted into a massive Hollywood blockbuster. I reread this book fairly regularly, it's my holiday read. And yeah, I know, my copy is pretty battered. I prefer the term well loved. Luckily though, I just received a hardbound classroom edition of The Martian and the cover for it is excellent. I don't know where Hayley finds all these great editions of books that I like, but I appreciate it greatly. At Shelf Life on Instagram. I will just say before I get started, if you've never read The Martian or you've never watched the movie, there will be some spoilers in this video. It's just kind of unavoidable. So what can we learn from Andy Weir's writing? The first technique I want to focus on, which he puts to great use in this book, is blurring the lines between fact and fiction. And that's, to some extent, to be expected from sci-fi. Some sci-fi stays really closely faithful to real-life physics, but Andy Weir kind of goes a step further by linking real accomplishments and achievements from the space program and from NASA into this Mars-based story from the future. And I really like that because I'm a space nerd. The best example of this, I think, is how the main character, Mark Watney, who is marooned on Mars alone, re-establishes communication with Earth. He's isolated for the vast majority of this book. No communications with Earth, no contact with any other human. He's alone on Mars. He can't even tell Houston that he's had a problem. Sorry. How Andy Weir found the resolution for this made me laugh out loud. I never considered an author mixing fact and fiction as specifically as he does here, but like a lot of what Andy Weir writes, or the science behind it, turns out it's actually fairly legit. For some context, the vast majority of the book is first person from Mark Watney's point of view, but every now and again the perspective changes to someone or something back on Earth. I'll talk a bit more about perspective in a while, but this is used here. We've been following Watney's day-to-day activities since the beginning of the book. Then we see him moving across Mars. We're looking down on him from this satellite point of view, kind of through NASA. And Andy Weir has NASA and the people watching the satellite footage wonder out loud where he might be going, which is echoing the thoughts of the reader. Still going in a straight line, Mindy said, pointing to her monitor. I see, Venkat said. He's sure as hell not going to Ares 4. Because we, the reader, have been right by Watney's side since the beginning of this book, watching his every move and sort of supervising him, we feel a little bit anxious to suddenly be watching him with no idea what's going on. We're watching his very basic movements from millions of miles away in very little detail, and that makes us kind of anxious. We're placed into NASA's pretty much powerless shoes while they sit and watch and hope that Watney doesn't get himself killed. So where does the fact meet the fiction? Well, that happens when NASA finally figure out where Watney's going. Wait, Venkat said. Wait, no way. The line passed through the exact centre of a bright yellow dot painted on the map. Pathfinder, Mindy said. He's going to Pathfinder. That's the point where I almost laughed out loud. Just the ingenuity of this just tickled me somehow. Watney uses a real piece of the space program. Pathfinder is still sitting up on Mars, buried in the dust, unresponsive but not necessarily broken, and Watney manages to use it to re-establish communication with Earth. I can't think of another example of something so concrete from the real world that an author uses to save the life of their fictional character. If you can, by all means leave me a comment below because I love this stuff. I just think that's clever, and it's a nice nod to the space program and to NASA, and thinking about your book's target audience, people are probably going to appreciate that. So if your story is set in the existing world, whether past, present or future, maybe consider mixing something concrete from the real world into it. And if you can twist that, it might just send a chill up your reader's spine. Kind of like the ending to the original Planet of the Apes, if you know what I mean. It's a neat technique. Next, I want to talk about some of the interesting things that Andy Weir does with perspective in The Martian. Like I mentioned before, the vast majority of the book is first person, and it's from Watney's point of view. That's kind of the anchor around which the rest of the book revolves. So when the perspective does change, it has some interesting effects on the scale of the story. There's lots of passages and chapters from the point of view of other people back on Earth, and that's interesting, and it's good storytelling, but it's pretty normal. but what if the main character from a passage is a piece of material? And it's interesting. In fact, it's pretty tense. For some much needed context, Watney's home base on Mars is this dome made of synthetic material that's obviously airtight and supports an atmosphere, but I said there'd be some spoilers, and at one point this material fails, causing a slight disaster. I'll just undersell it and say there's a fluctuation of air pressure. Andy Weir could have dealt with this just by having Mark Watney notice this piece of material just as it failed, and then boom. That would have told us everything that we needed to know about it. It would have been surprising, but in some way he would have lost the opportunity to build a bit of tension before it happened. So instead, in the preceding chapter, as Watney moves closer and closer to catastrophe, just going about his everyday tasks, the perspective shifts to these little vignettes about this material, and it traces the course of this material's production and its journey to get to Mars. It starts like this with manufacturing. The employees of Deo Plastics worked double shifts to finish the hab canvas for Ares 3. There was talk of triple shifts if NASA increased the order again. The effect of this is that you immediately think, well, why am I here? Why am I reading about this? A second ago I was on Mars, and now I'm reading about production of some material in a factory. And then you realise that it's part of the canvas. Okay, and they're working triple shifts. They must be in a hurry. Then you read on and follow Watney around as usual before another little vignette about this material pops up. There, a worker cut a strip off the edge, divided it into squares and put each through a series of rigorous tests. Which leaves you thinking, tests. I wonder what they're testing for and how vigorous those tests are. And then you go back to Watney, normal stuff, and then it shifts perspective again, back to the canvas. The man with the clipboard placed a sticker on the package. Project Ares 3 Hab Canvas, sheet AL102. Now we're focused on this one specific piece of the hab canvas, AL102. The tension's building by this point, and the shape of what is about to happen is slowly coming into focus. We flick back to Watney again, blissfully unaware and going about his everyday activities, and the next vignette shows the piece of canvas actually being put together by Watney's team before they left him on Mars. Beck stretched the sheet tight to the seal strips on the airlock's exterior. Once all airlocks were in place, Lewis flooded the hab with air and AL102 felt pressure for the first time. No pressure was lost. The setup had been perfect. So we can definitely feel the tension building now. We're pretty aware of what is about to happen. All the pieces are coming together for us. No pun intended. Here's some choice extracts from the next few vignettes then. The layers of plastic, constantly bending, heated the resin from pure friction. AL102 stretched. Every time the astronaut used the airlock, the strain on AL102 relaxed, then tightened anew. Pulling, stressing, weakening, stretching. So the whole time you're reading this, helplessly, you want to reach into the pages and warn Watney he's about to walk into a potentially lethal disaster. The effect of this is hugely immersive. It's got that car crash feeling to it. You don't want to look away, but you can't stand to watch. There's another example of this hyper-focus technique later in the book, centered around the launch of a rocket. The perspective focuses on a really tiny detail of a piece of the cargo that ends up affecting this rocket's entire trajectory. It might sound kind of boring when I put it like that, but when you know what's riding on the success of this rocket, it's actually really tense. It makes you feel like a helpless bystander, which of course you are, but I think that's supposed to mirror Watney's feeling as he's isolated and unable to do anything to help anyone. Another cool thing about The Martian is how the perspective shifts between first and third person. It's not all that uncommon to find a book that shifts between first and third person for its characters, but I've not seen too many books where that change is just on one character. Watney's interplanetary predicament is narrated in first person and third person, most of it first person as I keep saying, but every now and again it backs off into third person to give us a bit more scale and distance to what's going on. I was wondering why exactly that might be, but then I read a section relating to that disaster that I previously talked about, and it made it quite clear for me. Watney, on his back, stared blankly upward through the hole in his shattered faceplate. This is third person because it's better for description. You can see the entire scene of which Watney is a part rather than seeing it just a small, concentrated area of it through first person. It might also feel a bit strange for Watney to describe how dazed he was from first person. Third person just gives you a bit more distance as an author, and it's just a little bit more dramatic. First person has to come from within your character's thoughts, and so it can feel a bit stunted when a character's spending a lot of time describing something, because that's not generally how people think or speak. For me, I always feel like I have to stay in my lane when I'm writing a book, so if a character is first person, they remain first person. If they're third, they stay third. But this proves that isn't necessarily the case. Your perspective can change with what the story calls for. If there's clear benefits to telling a story in a specific way, you can do that. The Martian actually demonstrates a nice way to spice up first-person narration. Obviously the book's full of technology, being set on Mars, so that's incorporated into the storytelling. Some passages are presented as audio transcripts of Mark Watney speaking out loud, and others are instant messaging chats. I mean, I suppose not instant, because it takes 20 minutes to get back to Earth, or... Anyway, these passages are structured differently on the page, they look different, there's a different font, a different spacing, and that just breaks up all the first-person narration. If you're really not loving the voice of a protagonist in first person, having something to break it up every now and again is really effective, and it's just good storytelling to keep things interesting for a reader like that. So, what are the top things I've learned from Andy Weir's writing that I want to take and use in my own writing? The first is that I don't have to be so rigid with my perspective. If I'm writing in first person but something will be better in third, then I can change to that. I don't have to stick exactly in my lane, like I said before. The important thing to recognise here is what the story calls for. If something is better served by changing the perspective, then that's a much better way to tell the story, so I'm going to try and use that. Another thing I want to try is mixing something recognisable from reality into my story in some way, so I can twist it or make the reader feel strange when they see it. Of course, this is very much reliant on it being necessary for the story. If you kind of shoehorn something like this into the narrative just because it sounds cool, then that's probably not going to produce the best effect for you, and it might be a bit obvious. But if you can organically find some way to do that, I think it's an advantage to the book, no doubt. Overall, I think there's a lot to learn from Andy Weir's writing, especially in The Martian, because it's so readable and so entertaining. You can learn stuff about science, and it's just a great story overall. My aim with this channel is to support other writers and to help them develop their writing as I develop mine. I want to help you tell your best story, so if that sounds useful or you want to be a part of that, consider hitting the subscribe button. The button's down there somewhere. For more weekly videos like this, I want to say thank you for watching the video, and I will see you in the next one.